Tonight at 10, thousands of police officers deployed across France, ready for a possible third night of protest and violence. The clashes and the rioting started after police shot dead a 17-year-old boy in a suburb of Paris on Tuesday. The boy's mother was involved in a march this evening, where the police were accused of acting without fear of punishment.
What's fueling these fires isn't just rubbish bins and vehicles, but decades of frustration with the French state. Niall's death triggers wider feelings of grievance, betrayal and inequality.
Yes, we'll have the latest from our correspondent, Lucy Williamson, who's in Paris. Also tonight, judges at the Court of Appeal say that the plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda is unlawful. Ministers are unimpressed.
The British people will no longer indulge the polite fiction that we have a duty or infinite capacity to support everyone in the world who is fleeing persecution.
A defiant show of independence by women in Iran, part of evidence gathered by the BBC over many months. And England tried to seize the initiative in the Ashes on the second day at Lord's.
On BBC London, 3 years after the government's Everyone In lockdown scheme, we meet the last homeless man still living in a hotel.
Good evening. There are 40,000 police officers deployed across France tonight, ready to deal with a possible third night of protest and violence. The trouble started when police shot dead a 17-year-old boy in a suburb of Paris on Tuesday. The officer who shot the boy is facing an investigation for voluntary homicide. Last night, 170 officers were injured in clashes and 180 people were arrested. President Macron has again appealed for calm, especially in those cities where clashes have been taking place, including Lille in the north and then Lyon and Toulouse in the south. And the biggest trouble has been in the capital, Paris, and in the suburb of Nanterre. That's where the teenager, named as Nahel, was killed. There was more violence earlier today during a march led by Nahel's mother. The prospect of further rioting has led to the closure of the city's bus and tram services. Our Paris correspondent Lucy Williamson has the latest.
In Nanterre today, thousands gathered to mark the void left by one local teenager and the rage that flowed in to fill it. The violence here last night still mapped onto the surrounding streets in ash and debris. Niall's mother leading a chant of police assassins. Evan came from a suburb on the other side of Paris, but the problems there were just the same, he said.
We don't have jobs. We don't get hired if we don't lie on our CV. There's nothing for us. We feel abandoned. And on top of that, we get attacked by the people who are supposed to protect us. This is one offence too many.
The march ended this afternoon in a different kind of protest. Burning cars, tear gas, clashes with police. One local resident told us her own teenage son had been mistreated by police and that the violence following Niall's death was justified.
I wouldn't be surprised if the trouble continues as long as there are no consequences for this police officer. I'm not in the heads of the young people, but what's happening here is justified. The police are the delinquents here, not our youth. Parents are doing everything they can.
The officer is now in custody and facing a charge of voluntary homicide. France's Interior Minister said it was time for the violence to stop.
Last night's riots and burning a school, a town hall, a social centre, that has nothing to do with what happened in Nanterre. Those responsible for the troubles should now go home.
But no one we spoke to in Nanterre thought the anger here had run its course.
What's fueling these fires isn't just rubbish bins and vehicles, but decades of frustration with the French state. Niall's death triggers wider feelings of grievance, betrayal and inequality, and smouldering cars get the attention of France's leaders. in a way smouldering resentments rarely do.
Thousands of extra police were deployed across the Paris region last night. Tonight, those numbers are being multiplied again. Symbols of the state, providing extra security and extra targets.
Well, let's go live to Paris tonight and join Lucy, who's there at the Arc de Triomphe. Lucy, can I just pick up on the comment you made there in the report, where you said basically that what's going on here is not just to do with, obviously, police conduct, but it is to do with a much bigger sense of dissatisfaction with life in France.
Yes, I mean, there is anger at President Macron and his government. There's anger at politics in general, but there's also a deeper disappointment with the French state and the broken promises that people feel it makes to them. And the government is worried that that deeper disappointment might fuel a pattern of nightly riots. And so it's trying to curb the unrest really in two different ways. And it's walking something of a tightrope between them. On the one hand, it wants to show that it understands the anger people feel towards the policed actions that led to Niall's death. On the other, it's taking an increasingly tough policing approach to violence on the streets. And the atmosphere in Nanterre today was pretty tense at times, and I think there are many people here in Paris tonight who are watching very carefully what tonight will bring.
Lucy, many thanks again. Lucy Williamson there, our correspondent in Paris. The government's highly controversial plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda are unlawful, according to the Court of Appeal. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, claimed that the decision proved the system was rigged against the British people. Judges at the Court of Appeal ruled that Rwanda had not provided enough safeguards to prove it was a safe third country. The Prime Minister said he fundamentally disagreed with the ruling and the government would ask the UK Supreme Court to review the decision. Our Home Editor Mark Easton has the story.
The government's controversial Rwanda policy and asylum strategy have been dealt a significant blow today, with the appeal court concluding the East African country is not safe enough for the UK to send asylum seekers there. But the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Burnett, announced it had been a split decision. He thought Rwanda was safe, but his two colleagues did not.
The deficiencies in the asylum system in Rwanda are such that there are substantial grounds for believing that there is a real risk that persons sent to Rwanda will be returned to their home countries where they faced persecution or other inhumane treatment when in fact they have a good claim for asylum. In that sense, Rwanda is not a safe third country.
The government will be disappointed by today's majority judgment, a blow for the Home Secretary, who's expressed her personal enthusiasm for getting flights to Rwanda started as soon as possible. But that's not the end of the legal journey. The matter will almost certainly now move to the Supreme Court for a final hearing later this year. The Prime Minister could barely contain his anger, issuing a statement saying he fundamentally disagreed with the court's conclusion, insisting Rwanda was safe and that it was Britain and its government who should decide who comes here, not criminal gangs. The Home Secretary, who recently visited migrant accommodation in Rwanda, has confirmed the government does intend to appeal. But government lawyers will also be working out whether having no safe country they can lawfully send migrants to means the controversial illegal migration bill is now fatally flawed.
Well, the system is rigged against the British people. It's as simple as that. That's why we're changing the laws through our illegal migration bill. That's why we are rolling out a groundbreaking partnership with Rwanda, which we believe is lawful, with a country that we believe is safe. So we need to change the system, we need to change our laws. That's how we're going to stop the boats.
The government believes the threat of being forcibly removed to East Africa will deter people from crossing the Channel and entering the UK illegally. However, the Home Office's own impact assessment says there's little or no evidence that it will work. And in the Commons, the Labour Party said the Rwanda policy should be abandoned.
This Rwanda scheme is unworkable, unethical, extortionately expensive and a costly and damaging distraction from the urgent practical action we should be taking, from the plan. 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 plan
It is a year since a plane loaded with migrants and bound for Rwanda sat on the runway of an RAF base, unable to leave after judges intervened. Today's ruling means it will be months, if ever, before any similar flight is cleared for takeoff. Mark Easton, BBC News.
A secret police unit which spied on more than 1,000 political groups and trade union activists over 40 years should have been disbanded as far back as the 1970s. That's the conclusion of a senior judge heading an inquiry into undercover policing. In his first interim report, Sir John Mitting says that most of those people spied on were not a threat to state security, nor did they pose a risk of serious crime. Our Home Affairs correspondent June Kelly has the story.
London, 1968, and it was protests against the Vietnam War which led Scotland Yard to set up a new undercover police unit, the Special Demonstration Squad, to gather intelligence on anti-war activists.
They demonstrated against discrimination in what
But by the 1970s, the SDS had expanded, infiltrating dozens of groups, including the Women's Liberation Movement and the Anti-Apartheid Campaign. None of this was justified, and the SDS should have been disbanded early on, says the chair of the Undercover Policing Inquiry. Today, his words were quoted by those targeted.
The question is whether or not the end justifies the means. I have come to the firm conclusion that, for a unit of a police force, it did not.
Trade unionists in the construction industry lost their livelihoods. Police information on them was shared. They ended up blacklisted and on the breadline.
This is a national scandal. This report that's come out today should be the final nail in the coffin of the Metropolitan Police.
From the start, officers used the names of dead children as part of their cover stories, and some had sexual relationships with those they were spying on. Practices which went on for decades. Mark Kennedy, who was unmasked as a police spy in 2010, deceived a number of female activists.
We are treated in such a way, with such disdain, that we'll have kind of police officers inserted into our lives, sleeping with us, and notes and records kept on us. I feel that this is something in my head that should have been done by the Stasi in East Germany, not in our country.
With the benefit of hindsight, there should have been more work in relation to reviewing the information that was being gathered and more care taken in relation to the groups that were being infiltrated.
The Undercover Policing Inquiry will now examine the activities of the spy cops who infiltrated groups in the decades since the 60s and 70s. June Kelly, BBC News.
In Russia, President Putin has made further public appearances in what's being reported as an attempt to reassert control following the attempted rebellion last week by the mercenary soldiers known as the Wagner Group. But there have been questions today over the whereabouts of Sergei Surovikin, a senior general who had previously supported the Wagner Group leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's not been seen since Saturday morning when the coup attempt began. Our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, has the details.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
If you're the president and you faced a mutiny, what you really want are public displays of adoration. We're with you. We all support you, she says, at this Moscow event. Vladimir Putin liked that. And look what happened last night. Putin mobbed in Dagestan, in the south of Russia. Very un-Putin-like this, getting up close and personal with people. Good timing, though. A few days ago, it was the Wagner mercenaries being cheered, including their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, as they ended their rebellion. State TV went into overdrive about Putin. Even rock stars don't get this treatment, she says.
This is a turbocharged Putin we're seeing suddenly. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere, trying to show he's super popular and in control. But having survived this mutiny, Russia's president faces another pressing task, trying to work out who he can trust.
Can he trust this senior commander? General Surovikin was head of Russia's invasion force in Ukraine. He's thought to have been close to Mr. Prigozhin. He hasn't been seen in public since Saturday, fueling speculation he may be under suspicion. For many here, the mutiny has added to the atmosphere of uncertainty as Russia's war in Ukraine grinds on. In reality, few Russians are cheering about what's happening to Russia, but some still have hope.
When this story would finish on this or other way, then would be a new beginning. And it's necessary to be prepared.
But will a new beginning be better or possibly worse?
First it would be worse. And then, if we survive, it would be a window of opportunity. And it would be necessary to use it.
As for Russia's immediate future, after the mutiny, that's unclear. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
The former First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, says she still worries about the country's level of resources, such as PPE equipment, to deal with the COVID pandemic. Giving evidence to the UK's COVID inquiry, Ms Sturgeon highlighted what she said was a key difference between the approaches of the Scottish and UK governments, saying that her government had tried to suppress the virus as much as possible rather than deciding to try to live with it. Our health editor Huw Pym has the story.
The Chief Medical Officer and I will take questions shortly.
Scotland's First Minister throughout the pandemic, Nicola Sturgeon, hosted frequent media briefings on the government's response.
And nothing but the truth.
Today she was taking questions at the UK public inquiry.
The pandemic may be over, but for very many people that suffering continues to this day, and there is not a day that passes that I don't think about that.
She acknowledged that pre-pandemic planning suffered because there was more focus on a possible no-deal Brexit.
We had no choice but to do that planning. I deeply regret any implications that had for our emergency planning in other areas.
Continuing on the Brexit theme, she was interrupted by the Inquiry Council.
Every aspect of Brexit has been false economy, if I can put it mildly, but that's another issue altogether.
Ms Sturgeon, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
That is a witness box, not a soapbox.
Indeed.
We cannot allow
Indeed.
the political debate of Brexit
Indeed.
to be ventilated here.
Governments of this country did not prepare for that.
After her evidence, representatives of bereaved families in Scotland gave their reaction.
They're not interested in the war that's taken place, the turf wars that have taken place. They want to know, did they follow the science or did they listen to Westminster? Were they in agreement? And if they were in agreement, then does that mean that they just simply followed in the footsteps of Boris Johnson?
Nicola Sturgeon will return with other ministers for the next phase of the inquiry in the autumn. That'll focus on decisions before and during lockdowns by the UK government and devolved administrations.
And Huw was with me. That was really about resources in the past, Huw. Tomorrow, there'll be focus on resources in future in terms of staffing, notably in England.
Yes, Huw, the long-awaited NHS workforce plan in England will be published tomorrow. It's been quite a wait. It was first being talked about early last year, but it is going to come out tomorrow. It's being billed as the most comprehensive of its kind, with thousands more medical school places and nurse training places and for other health professionals, and an expansion of apprenticeships, allowing people, if they wish, to join the NHS in a health job and then study to become a nurse, or potentially even do medical training while they are working in the NHS. Now, a reminder today, though, of the challenges for workforce, with a study by the Nuffield Trust think tank for the BBC on staff sickness rates in the NHS in England. 5.6% of days lost last year, up by nearly a third on 2019, with mental health issues seen as one of the main problems here, as well as COVID and flu. And this raises more questions about staff burnout and pressure and morale. So a lot of people, I think, will be studying the publication tomorrow on the health and well-being area, and to what extent retention is being focused on, as well as recruitment.
Huw, many thanks. Again, Huw Pym, our health editor there, on the news that's being expected tomorrow. Allies of the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, have been accused of a deliberate campaign to interfere with an official parliamentary inquiry into the conduct of Mr Johnson when he was Prime Minister. Nadine Dorries, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg and 8 other supporters of Mr Johnson are all criticised for trying to lobby or intimidate members of the committee, which was investigating whether Mr Johnson had misled Parliament over lockdown parties in Downing Street. The MPs accused the committee of trying to shut down freedom of speech, as our political correspondent Ben Wright explains.
I think it makes kangaroo courts look respectable. They put out the case for the prosecution before they'd heard from the defence.
Boris Johnson will be found guilty by this kangaroo court. There is no doubt about that.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly, involved here.
Views from 3 of the 8 Tory politicians named in today's report, all allies of Boris Johnson, whose comments and tweets about a panel of MPs that investigated the former Prime Minister have been slammed by the same committee, which said the attacks were a coordinated campaign to interfere with their work, that had a significant personal impact on individual members and raised significant security concerns.
I would again reiterate it is in this House's interest that we have such a committee. It is there to defend our rights and privileges, and it is absolutely vital that members of this House are prepared to serve on such committees.
Labour said MPs who'd criticised the investigation had damaged the work of the Commons.
Mr Speaker, this undermines democracy. It undermines this House. We owe it to the members of the Privileges Committee to give them our support. And frankly, it's about time the Prime Minister showed up and showed some leadership.
I'm actually going to church.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, who had talked about a kangaroo court, was less chatty today.
And then I shall be at the Test match, which I'm looking forward to. Thank you so much.
But another ally of Boris Johnson did take a swing at the new report.
Well, ultimately, I believe in a healthy democracy, MPs must be free to speak their minds, and it cannot be the case that rulings of a particular committee stifle their freedom to express their views.
But that seems a very minority view around here, and the committee itself was emphatic. It said MPs had no right to undermine an inquiry like this, and called an attack on the procedures of the Commons an attack on the legitimacy of Parliament itself. Politicians must tell the truth to Parliament. That's the principle being enforced. The committee charged with doing so says more explicit protections are now needed, as the aftershocks from Boris Johnson's conduct continue to be felt. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
The BBC has gathered new evidence of the abuse and mistreatment of women in Iran. Many women continue to defy the strict morality laws despite risking harsh punishment. Last September, mass protests were seen in the capital, Tehran, and in other cities, following the death of this young woman, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, in police custody. She'd been accused of breaking the strict rules on how women should wear the hijab, or headscarf. Weeks of protests followed her death, resulting in a brutal government crackdown, and then the deaths of more than 530 people, according to an Iranian human rights agency. What followed was that women then took to the streets, removing their hijabs, cutting their hair. Iran's security forces portrayed these protests as riots instigated by foreign agencies. Now, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to obtain video from inside Iran. The BBC's journalists are not allowed to work there. But a team in the UK has carefully studied and carefully verified hundreds of videos posted on social media showing the protests in detail. Our correspondent Yalda Hakim reports on what's been found.
In September 2022, the death of a young woman, Mahsa Amini, in police custody triggered anti-government protests across Iran.
A family member wept at her graveside.
I swear to God that when she left home, her clothes were so appropriate. She was dressed more appropriately than all of your daughters.
The Iranian authorities pledged to investigate Mahsa's death.
Woman, life, freedom.
They insisted that the protests were organized by foreign powers. A BBC documentary team has analysed over 100 hours of footage from those protests and verified 350 videos.
The killing of Mahsa happened.
I was transformed from an actress interested in women's rights into an activist.
Zar Amir Ibrahimi was once a famous TV actor in Iran. She's now an international movie star. And she's been gathering testimony on how the authorities responded in the early days of the uprising.
How are you, Miss Amir Ibrahim?
I'm fine, thanks. I'm very glad to meet you.
Nasreen had a teenage daughter called Nika. An old video recording shows her singing with friends.
She was extremely adventurous and fearless. I was always afraid that something would happen to her.
4 days after Mahsa Amini died, Nika was filmed setting fire to her headscarf.
Death to the dictator.
I told her that it is dangerous and please come home. She finally said she would. I could hear other protesters shouting, the security forces.
They never heard from her again. Her death certificate stated she died from multiple injuries caused by the impact of a hard object. The regime denied wrongdoing and made inconsistent claims about her death.
I personally have a lot of respect for Nika's bravery and free spirit. I believe that we are living in a specific point in history where such events are needed.
In Iran today, the mass street protests have died down for now. But acts of defiance continue on social media. A popular Afrobeat song is being used as a song of solidarity. Dancing like this can get you arrested, but they're still dancing. You can watch the full documentary Inside the Iranian Uprising on BBC iPlayer. Yalda Hakim, BBC News.
Let's turn then to some of the day's cricket news. And on the second day of the second Ashes Test at Lord's, England have been fighting back, bowling out Australia for 416 in their first innings. And in reply, England finished the day 278 for 4. That's 138 runs behind Australia. Our correspondent Joe Wilson was watching.
A light in the gloom. Andrew Strauss on the day Lord's in red remembers his late wife Ruth and raises money for families dealing with bereavement. England began smartly.
Taken by Bairstow.
Yeah, Johnny Bairstow was catching people again, Australia's Mitchell Starc in this instance. But here's the big wicket, Steve Smith. Another success for Josh Tongue on a strong Ashes debut. Smith made 110 and was gutted. Australia soon all out.
Well, England could feel satisfied with that, but now it was their turn to bat in reply to Australia's 416. A challenge, an opportunity.
Quickly, Ben Duckett was making Australia chase in vain. England's batting looked strong and smooth. Australia's Nathan Lyon was in pain. After that, in his 100th consecutive Test match, we wonder about his immediate future. It's his calf. Australia had to try something. They did. Duckett tempted and trapped and out for 98. England couldn't resist. That's Joe Root, clutched and held by Steve Smith. Harry Brook batting. This is still a Test match, isn't it? Second day? Well, England feel fortune favours the brave, and it did here. Brook dropped. They'll resume 138 behind, and of the two captains, maybe Australia's is the more nervous. Joe Wilson, BBC News, Lord's.
Well, the time is 29 minutes past 10, and Darren's with me tonight with all the weather news. Hi, Darren.
Hello, Huw. It could be a bit more difficult for batting tomorrow because the weather's going to change a bit. It's going to look and feel quite different from today, where we had a cooler, fresher day today with some sunshine. Lovely end to the day there in West Yorkshire. But we are going to find things changing because look at all this cloud that we've got here. This is all speeding in from the Atlantic. It's already arrived in some western areas, and that cloud will continue to thicken up overnight. It's going to bring some rain. We've already got some of that in Scotland. We'll see some rain coming into Northern Ireland, into Wales and the southwest later on in the night. It will be generally 9 to 11 degrees tonight, and that means comfortably cooler in the southeast and East Anglia than it was last night, where it was down to 17 Celsius. Tomorrow we may all have some early sunshine in eastern Scotland and eastern parts of England. Don't think it's going to last too long because all this cloud is coming in on that westerly breeze. You can see there's a bit of rain and drizzle. Probably gets wetter in Scotland and Northern Ireland later, and temperatures here humid, sort of 17 or 18 degrees, could make 20 or 21 in East Anglia and the southeast. These fairly weak weather fronts are bringing the cloud and rain. They will tend to push away just in time for the weekend, but around that area of low pressure we're going to have a west to northwesterly wind this weekend. So it's not going to be that warm, and we're going to have a mixture of sunshine and showers. Back into fresher air by this time, less humidity on Saturday. Most of the showers in the northern half of the UK, pretty frequent and maybe heavy across northern and western parts of Scotland. Temperatures in the central belt may only reach 16 degrees, whereas in the southeast of England, a very pleasant 24 Celsius come the afternoon. Second half of the weekend, not too many changes really. Again, it's quite blustery out there. The strongest winds in the north again. That's where we've got most of the showers. Wetter again for northern and western parts of Scotland. It could be a dry weekend for many southern areas of the UK, and our top temperature is going to be around 22 or 23 degrees. Nothing to get too excited about. And really the weather pattern for next week is not what we'd expect for this time of the year. It's going to be a slow area of low pressure that's going to be over the UK, and that will keep it on the cool side. Maybe not 8 degrees, a little bit warmer than that, but there will be some showers around as well. Huw.
OK, Darren, many thanks once again. Darren Beth there, and that's BBC News at 10 on Thursday, the 29th of June. More analysis of the day's main stories coming up for you, as usual, on BBC Two, on Newsnight, and it's Kirsty standing by to present Newsnight tonight. On BBC One, of course, all of our colleagues in the nations and regions standing by with the news where you are. But from all of us here on the 10 team, thanks for watching and good night.